It was a quiet, chilly evening, the kind of night where most people would be rushing to get home and escape the cold. The streetlights flickered faintly as Jordan stood on the corner of 5th and Main, his breath visible in the air. He carried 2 worn duffel bags, the weight of the day etched into his tired expression. This ride was supposed to be simple, a quick trip home after a long day. But tonight, simplicity was out of reach. The sound of a car door slamming shut pierced the silence, and then came the voice, sharp, cutting, and filled with disdain. "Get out!" I said, "Get out of my car." Jordan, visibly confused, tried to reason with the man behind the wheel. His calm tone clashed against the driver's growing hostility. Mr. White, a middle-aged man with a stiff jaw and cold eyes, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I've had enough of your kind." "Out," he barked, his words laced with venom that needed no further explanation. Jordan glanced around. It was late, the streets were nearly empty, and the nearest open business was a block away. He felt the weight of his surroundings alone, vulnerable and unfairly targeted. But this wasn't just about being thrown out of a car. It was about something much deeper, something far uglier. "Why are you doing this?" Jordan asked, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. He reached for his phone, hoping to document the unfolding incident. But his calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate the driver further. "I don't owe you an explanation," Mr. White snapped. "I don't feel safe with you in my car. Now, get out before I call the cops." And with that, Jordan stepped out, his bags dragging behind him as the car sped off into the night, leaving him stranded in the glow of a flickering street lamp. This was no ordinary ride, no simple misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a chain of events that would expose systemic injustice, spark public outrage, and lead to a reckoning for Mr. White. What unfolded next would send ripples through a community and force a corporation to confront its own accountability. A late-night ride home turns into a nightmare for Jordan. The narrator's voice declares, setting the tone for the story ahead. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Brief flashes illuminate the screen, a corporate email, a social media post going viral, a crowd chanting for justice, and a somber man, the driver, facing the consequences of his actions. Redemption for one, regret for another. But it all starts here, at this lonely corner on a cold, dark night. This is Jordan's story, the narrator concludes, and it's one you'll never forget. Jordan Thomas was a young man who seemed to radiate positivity wherever he went. At just 27 years old, he was on a path that made his family proud. A recent graduate working as a marketing analyst, he balanced his career ambitions with a deep sense of community. Always the one to help others, Jordan often volunteered at local shelters, spoke at youth empowerment events, and still found time to visit his grandmother every Sunday for dinner. Tonight had been one of those cherished family evenings. He'd spent hours laughing over his grandmother's stories, enjoying the warmth of home-cooked meals, and catching up with his cousins. As the evening wound down, Jordan had opted to call an Uber rather than risk the unreliable late-night buses. With 2 bags filled with leftovers and gifts from his family, he was ready to head home and prepare for the week ahead. Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Richard White, a man in his mid-50s, was wrapping up another long day behind the wheel of his Uber. Mr. White wasn't an outwardly hostile man, at least not to most, but there was something in his demeanor, a quiet resentment that simmered just below the surface. For Richard, his job wasn't just about picking up passengers, it was a window into a world he often judged harshly. Over time, these judgments had hardened into prejudices, shaping his interactions in ways he barely noticed or perhaps chose to ignore. His dashboard was cluttered with fast food wrappers and receipts, and a small American flag dangled from the rearview mirror. A conservative talk radio station played faintly in the background, the voices discussing topics that often validated his biases. Richard didn't think of himself as a bad man. He had rules, preferences, and in his words, the right to feel comfortable in his own car. But those rules always seemed to shift depending on who stepped into his backseat. Jordan's request for a ride popped up on Richard's phone just as he considered calling it a night. He sighed but accepted it, muttering under his breath about the pickup location. It was a neighborhood he didn't particularly like, though he'd never admit why. "Last one," he grumbled, putting the car into gear. When he pulled up to the curb, Richard's eyes flicked to Jordan, who was standing under the streetlight with his bags in hand. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something in Richard's expression, but he unlocked the doors and waited. "Hey, thanks for picking me up," Jordan said warmly as he slid into the back seat, carefully arranging his bags beside him. Richard offered a curt nod, barely making eye contact as he checked the destination on his phone. Late night, huh?" he muttered, his tone neutral but distant. "Yeah, Family dinner ran a bit long, Jordan replied, trying to lighten the mood. You know how it is when everyone gets to talking. Family dinner, huh? Must be nice, Richard said, his words clipped. There was an edge to his tone, a subtle hint that the conversation was already unwelcome. Jordan noticed but chose not to read too much into it. Instead, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through social media to pass the time. The car was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radio, but the silence felt heavier than it should have. So, where you headed? Back to the city, Richard asked suddenly, his eyes flicking to Jordan in the rearview mirror. Yeah, just heading home, Jordan replied. Gotta get ready for work tomorrow. It's been a long day. Richard nodded but didn't respond. Instead, his eyes darted back to the road, his grip on the wheel tightening slightly. A few minutes passed before he spoke again, this time with a tone that was harder to ignore. You live out that way, huh? Must be interesting. Jordan glanced up from his phone, sensing the shift. Yeah, it's a great spot. Quiet, close to everything. I guess I don't go out that way much. The air in the car grew tense. Jordan wasn't sure if it was the driver's tone or the way he kept glancing in the mirror, but something felt off. He shifted in his seat, trying to shake the unease creeping over him. Richard continued, seemingly oblivious or perhaps intentionally ignorant of how his words landed. You know, I don't usually pick up this late. Some areas just don't feel safe at night. Jordan paused before replying, his voice measured. Well, I appreciate you making the trip. Yeah, well, let's just hope it's a quick one, Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jordan to hear but quiet enough to feign innocence. Jordan decided to let it slide. He'd had enough experiences to recognize when someone was testing boundaries, and he wasn't about to take the bait. Instead, he turned his attention back to his phone, silently willing the ride to end without further incident. But as the city lights blurred past and the minutes dragged on, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary ride. The tension in the car was palpable, each passing moment adding to the sense of unease. Richard's passive-aggressive remarks, the subtle glances in the mirror, the way his knuckles tightened on the wheel, all of it pointed to something simmering beneath the surface. Jordan didn't know it yet, but this ride was about to take a turn that would change both their lives forever. The ride had been quiet for the most part, though not in the comforting way silence can sometimes feel. For Jordan, the air inside the car felt heavy, oppressive, even. He kept glancing out the window, watching the familiar streets of the city flash by as they moved closer to his neighborhood. The driver's earlier comments had set a tone that Jordan couldn't ignore, and the occasional sharp glance from the rearview mirror only added to the unease. So, what do you do? Richard asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His tone was casual, but the question came out of nowhere, startling Jordan slightly. I work in marketing, Jordan replied politely. Mostly digital campaigns. It's pretty interesting work. Marketing, huh? Richard said, the faintest hint of skepticism in his voice. Must be nice. A lot of people these days seem to think they can just sit at a computer and make big money. Never had to break a sweat, huh? Jordan paused, unsure if the comment was meant to be a jab. He decided to brush it off. It's definitely challenging, but I enjoy it, he said, keeping his tone neutral. The car fell silent again for a moment, but it didn't last long. Richard reached for the radio dial and turned up the volume slightly, a classic rock station filling the car with music. Jordan wasn't particularly a fan, but he didn't say anything. It wasn't worth the trouble. You don't like this kind of music, do you? Richard asked, his eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. There was something in his tone almost accusatory. Jordan hesitated, unsure how to respond. It's not really my go-to, but it's fine, he said, trying to keep the peace. Yeah, didn't think so, Richard muttered, more to himself than to Jordan. I guess you're more into that rap stuff, huh? Jordan froze for a moment, his grip tightening on his phone. There it was, the first unmistakable jab. He'd heard comments like this before, casual in delivery, but loaded with judgment. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. I listened to a lot of different things, he said evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. Sure, Richard replied, his tone dismissive. Figures. The tension in the car was thick now, and Jordan could feel his heart rate increasing. He glanced out the window, realizing they were taking a route he didn't recognize. Is this the fastest way, he asked, trying to sound casual but unable to mask the concern in his voice. Richard let out a sharp laugh. I know what I'm doing. Been driving these streets longer than you've been alive, he said. Don't worry, you'll get there. But Jordan wasn't convinced. The streets outside were dimly lit, unfamiliar, and growing increasingly desolate. He pulled up the route on his phone to double-check. And that's when Richard's tone shifted. "What, you don't trust me now?" Richard snapped, glancing at Jordan in the mirror. "Typical." "It's not that," Jordan replied quickly, keeping his voice calm. "I just wanted to make sure everything's on track." "On track," Richard repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, I get it. You people are always so quick to assume the worst." Jordan's stomach dropped. The comment was direct enough to leave no doubt about its meaning. He looked up from his phone, meeting Richard's gaze in the mirror. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice firm now. "You heard me," Richard said, his tone defensive. "You're sitting back there, judging me like I'm the bad guy. I've had enough of this nonsense tonight." Jordan's calm exterior was beginning to crack. "Look, I just want to get home," he said. "There's no need for this." "No need for this," Richard repeated mockingly. "You're the one making a big deal out of nothing." And then, without warning, Richard slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to the side of the road. Jordan lurched forward slightly, the sudden stop catching him off guard. "That's it," Richard barked. "Out. I don't have to deal with this." Jordan looked around. The street was dark, lined with abandoned buildings and empty lots. "You can't just leave me here," he said, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "I can do whatever I want," Richard shot back. "You're making me uncomfortable, and I have the right to refuse service." "Making you uncomfortable?" Jordan repeated, incredulous. "I haven't done anything." "I don't feel safe with you in my car," Richard said, his voice rising. "Now get out before I call the cops." Jordan's mind raced. He knew what this was, and he knew he had to document it. He pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice clear but controlled. "You're leaving me stranded for no reason." Richard's face twisted in anger as he noticed the phone. "Oh, great. Now you're recording me. You people always looking for a way to play the victim," he sneered. "I'm recording this because what you're doing is wrong," Jordan replied. "You can't just abandon someone in the middle of nowhere." "I can do whatever I want," Richard snapped. "It's my car, my rules." The exchange escalated further, Richard growing more defensive and belligerent as Jordan stood his ground. Finally, with one last venomous glare, Richard threw open his door, stepped out of the car, and hurled Jordan's bags onto the sidewalk. "There. You're out," Richard said, slamming the door shut before speeding off into the night. Jordan stood there, the faint glow of his phone illuminating his face as he recorded the retreating car. He felt a mix of anger, frustration, and determination. He wasn't going to let this slide. Clutching his bags, he looked down at his phone, the video still rolling. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm reporting this. People need to see what's really going on." The camera captured the dark, empty street behind him as Jordan began walking, the weight of the moment sinking in. But little did he know, the video he just recorded was about to ignite a firestorm that would change everything. The walk home was long and cold, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on Jordan. By the time he reached his apartment, his feet ached, and his emotions swirled between anger and disbelief. He set his bags down by the door and sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. The video he'd recorded played back on the screen, the harsh words and hostile tone replaying like an unwelcome echo. "This has to stop," Jordan said to himself, determination cutting through his exhaustion. He opened the Uber app and navigated to the help center, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed out a detailed report of the incident. He uploaded the video, making sure to include every moment that captured the driver's hostility. "Hopefully this will get their attention," he muttered, pressing send. A generic reply came almost instantly, thanking him for his feedback and promising a follow-up within 24 hours. But the robotic tone of the message only added to his frustration. This wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a blatant act of discrimination, and it deserved more than a cookie-cutter response. Jordan sat back, staring at the screen, and then made a decision. He opened Twitter, his mind racing as he composed a post that would capture the gravity of what had happened. "Last night, I was thrown out of an Uber car by a driver who targeted me because of the color of my skin. I have video proof of his actions, and this kind of behavior has no place in 2024. Racism accountability." He attached the video hit post and watched as the tweet went live. At first, the notifications trickled in slowly likes and retweets from his friends and family. But within an hour, the trickle became a flood. His phone buzzed nonstop as strangers from across the world shared his story, expressing outrage and solidarity. By morning, Jordan's post had gone viral. News outlets began reaching out, asking for interviews and permission to air the video. Messages of support poured in, but so did comments of skepticism and outright hostility. Some users questioned his motives, accusing him of overreacting or fabricating the story for attention. Typical, Jordan thought, shaking his head. He'd seen this kind of response before, people trying to discredit those who spoke up against injustice. But he wasn't about to back down. The video spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, major news networks were running the story. Clips of Jordan's calm but firm confrontation with Mr. White played on television screens across the country, accompanied by headlines like "Racist Uber driver exposed" and "Passengers courageous stand against discrimination." Social media erupted with hashtags like "Justice for Jordan" and "Rideshare," drawing attention from activists, celebrities, and even politicians. The incident sparked broader conversations about accountability in the gig economy and the need for stricter measures to prevent discrimination in rideshare services. For Jordan, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. His phone didn't stop ringing, and his email inbox overflowed with messages from reporters, supporters, and even lawyers offering to help him take legal action. The attention was a double-edged sword. It validated his experience, but also put him under intense scrutiny. "You're so brave for standing up," one message read. "I'm sorry this happened to you, but thank you for sharing your story." "Stop playing the victim," another comment said. "This is why people don't trust the media anymore." Wooden tried to focus on the positive, but the negativity gnawed at him. He began questioning if sharing the video had been the right decision. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the countless messages from others who'd experienced similar discrimination and saw his story as a beacon of hope. Back in his quiet suburban home, Richard White was fuming. He'd seen the video, how could he not? It was all over the internet, and his name was trending for all the wrong reasons. He paced his living room, the blinds drawn tightly as though they could block out the world's judgment. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glaring at his phone. "I didn't do anything wrong." Richard began crafting a post of his own, determined to tell his side of the story. In it, he claimed he'd felt unsafe during the ride and had acted out of self-preservation. He accused Jordan of being disruptive and aggressive, though his words lacked evidence to back them up. His post gained some traction, but not the kind he'd hoped for. Instead of support, he faced a deluge of criticism. "This just makes you look worse," one comment read. "Unsafe? You were the one yelling at him," said another. But Richard couldn't let it go. He doubled down, giving a local radio interview where he defended his actions and made veiled comments that only revealed more of his biases. His words added fuel to the fire, further tarnishing his reputation. The days following the incident were some of the most challenging of Jordan's life. He felt the weight of the world's gaze, every step outside his apartment feeling like a public appearance. At work, his colleagues rallied around him, but there was an unspoken tension. Some worried the controversy might bring unwanted attention to the company. "You're handling this so well," his manager said during a meeting. "Just try to keep things professional, okay?" Jordan nodded, but the comment stung. Professionalism wasn't the issue, justice was. Still, he understood the fine line he was walking. He didn't want his fight for accountability to jeopardize the career he'd worked so hard to build. At night, the emotional toll hit hardest. He replayed the video over and over, questioning every word he'd said, every choice he'd made. Could he have handled it differently? Would it have mattered? He opened his messages and found one from a young man who had seen the video. "I've been in your shoes, man," it read. "What you did, it gives people like me hope. Don't let them silence you." Jordan closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He wasn't alone in this fight, and that gave him strength. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't let this moment pass without making it count. "This is bigger than me," he whispered to himself. "This is about all of us." The uproar over the incident showed no signs of slowing down. By the end of the week, Uber found itself in the eye of a growing storm. Emails from reporters flooded their press office. Social media was ablaze with calls for action, and customers began threatening to boycott the company unless it addressed the situation. "Uber cannot remain silent," read one viral post. "If you don't stand against racism, you stand with it." Behind the scenes, executives scrambled to contain the damage. The video evidence Jordan had shared was damning. There was no denying what had occurred. Adding to the urgency, former passengers of Richard White began stepping forward, sharing their own experiences with the driver. Their stories painted a chilling picture of a pattern of prejudice that had gone unchecked. "He told me I didn't look like I lived there when he picked me up in my own neighborhood," one woman shared in a comment. "I felt so humiliated. I thought it was just me," another man wrote. "He made these sarcastic comments about my accent the whole ride. It's clear now he's just a hateful person." After days of mounting pressure, Uber released an official statement on their website and social media accounts. It read, "At Uber, we have zero tolerance for racism or discrimination of any kind. The incident involving driver Richard White is under thorough investigation, and we are reviewing all relevant evidence, including the video shared by Jordan. We are committed to ensuring our platform is safe and welcoming for all users. Further action will follow shortly. The statement was a start, but for many it wasn't enough. People wanted to see concrete consequences and systemic changes. The pressure escalated as news outlets continued covering the story, pushing Uber to respond more decisively. "We hear your concerns," a follow-up statement from Uber CEO read a few days later. As of today, Richard White has been permanently removed from the Uber platform. In addition, we are reviewing our driver screening and complaint resolution processes to ensure that incidents like this are addressed more effectively in the future. The announcement was met with widespread support, but it also opened the floodgates for more criticism. Why had it taken such a public outcry to prompt action? How many other drivers with similar behavior were still on the platform? Jordan's case had become a catalyst for a broader reckoning within the rideshare industry. For Richard White, the fallout was swift and harsh. The news of his ban from Uber made headlines, and his name became synonymous with the story. At first, he tried to deny the allegations, doubling down on his earlier claims of feeling unsafe during the ride. "This whole thing is blown out of proportion," he said in a local TV interview. "I've always treated my passengers fairly, and this guy just had it out for me. He wanted to make me look bad." But his words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. The video footage, combined with the accounts from former passengers, left little room for doubt. As the backlash intensified, Richard found himself ostracized in his own community. Neighbors avoided him. His online profiles were flooded with angry comments, and even local businesses where he was a regular started keeping their distance. "I don't want that kind of attention here," said the owner of a nearby cafe when asked about Richard. "We're all about inclusivity, and what he did doesn't reflect our values." Feeling cornered, Richard eventually released a public apology, or what was supposed to be one. In a short video posted online, he sat stiffly in his living room, reading from a piece of paper. "I regret how things escalated during that ride," he began, his voice lacking conviction. "I never intended to make anyone feel unwelcome, and I apologize if my actions were misunderstood." The reaction was immediate and brutal. "If my actions were misunderstood, that's not an apology," one user tweeted. "You regret being caught, not what you did," another comment read. The video only deepened the public's disdain for Richard, solidifying his fall from grace. While Richard faced the consequences of his actions, Jordan found himself on an entirely different trajectory. The overwhelming public support buoyed him, and the opportunities that followed were beyond anything he could have imagined. He was invited to appear on major talk shows, where he shared his story with millions of viewers. Hosts praised his courage and composure in the face of such blatant discrimination. His calm but firm demeanor during the incident became a symbol of resilience, and many began to see him as a spokesperson for addressing systemic racism in modern society. "This isn't just about me," Jordan explained during one interview. "It's about creating a world where no one has to go through what I did. We need better accountability, not just from companies like Uber, but across all industries." Offers poured in for speaking engagements at universities, conferences, and corporate email, where Jordan used these platforms to advocate for meaningful change, including mandatory diversity training for rideshare drivers and more transparent processes for addressing passenger complaints. "It's not enough to say you stand against racism," he said during one speech. "You have to back it up with action policies, education, and a commitment to doing better." Beyond the professional opportunities, the incident also brought out the best in Jordan's community. His neighbors organized a rally in support of him, turning a small park near his apartment into a space for solidarity and shared stories. "Your strength has inspired us all," one attendee told him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for standing up." Jordan felt a deep sense of purpose as he looked out at the crowd, holding up a sign that read "No room for racism" in bold letters. The incident, though painful, had sparked something much larger than himself, a movement toward justice and accountability. Despite the challenges he'd faced, Jordan knew this was just the beginning. His story had resonated far and wide, and now he had the platform to ensure that no one else would be left stranded in the darkness. The turning point for justice came with a landmark announcement from Uber. In a high-profile press conference streamed online and covered by major news networks, the company's CEO stood at a podium, flanked by representatives from civil rights organizations. "We want to make one thing clear," the CEO began, his voice measured but resolute. "Uber condemns all forms of discrimination. What happened to Jordan should never have occurred, and we are taking immediate steps to ensure our platform is a safe and equitable space for everyone." The room buzzed with anticipation as he outlined the new policies. Effective immediately, all Uber drivers would be required to undergo mandatory sensitivity and anti-bias training. The company also announced an enhanced reporting system that would allow passengers to flag discriminatory behavior more easily, with a commitment to faster, more transparent investigations. "We are partnering with leading experts in diversity and inclusion to create these programs," he continued. "This isn't just about fixing what went wrong, it's about building a future where incidents like this are no longer possible." The announcement was met with cautious optimism. For Jordan, watching the live stream from his apartment, it was a moment of vindication. His voice had sparked real change, and the ripple effects were undeniable. But he also knew this was just the beginning. While Uber worked to repair its image, Richard White's life continued to unravel. Banned from the platform, he struggled to find work. His name, now a digital scarlet letter, followed him everywhere. Employers hesitated to hire him, fearing the backlash his presence might bring. The once confident driver was now a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. One day, as Richard walked into a local diner, hoping for a moment of respite, he overheard a group of patrons whispering at a nearby table. "That's him," one of them murmured, glancing in his direction. "The guy from that Uber story." The whispers turned into stares, and Richard could feel the weight of their judgment. He quickly left, his appetite gone. At home, he tried to retreat into anonymity, but the internet never forgot. Posts and comments about him continued to surface, ensuring his name remained a cautionary tale. For Richard, the consequences extended beyond the professional sphere. His family distanced themselves, unable to reconcile his actions with their values. Even friends who had initially defended him began to pull away, realizing the extent of his prejudices. "This isn't the man I thought I knew," one former friend said in a local interview. "It's heartbreaking, but he brought this on himself." In contrast, Jordan's life had transformed into a beacon of hope and change. Invitations to speak at universities, corporations, and conferences continued to pour in. But Jordan's proudest achievement came in the form of a grassroots initiative he co-founded with community leaders, a program designed to combat racism within the gig economy. "We're calling it Drive for Justice," Jordan announced at the launch event, standing before a crowd of supporters. "This is about holding companies accountable, but it's also about empowering drivers and passengers to stand up against discrimination." The initiative offered free workshops on diversity and inclusion, as well as resources for drivers to report harassment or discrimination from passengers. It also created a space for passengers to share their stories, building a database of experiences that would push for systemic change. One of the most poignant moments came during a community event held by the initiative. A young woman approached Jordan, her hands trembling as she handed him a folded piece of paper. "This is my story," she said softly. "I never thought anyone would care, but seeing what you did, it gave me the courage to speak up." Jordan unfolded the paper and read her words. Her story, like his, was one of being dismissed, belittled, and ultimately ignored by a system that was supposed to protect her. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a sense of shared understanding. "Your voice matters," he told her, "and together, we're going to make sure it's heard." Jordan's story sparked a wave of similar accounts from people across the country. Social media was flooded with hashtags like Drive for Justice and Voices Off Change, creating a virtual space for those who had experienced discrimination to share their stories and demand accountability. "This movement isn't just about me," Jordan emphasized in an interview with a national news outlet. "It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel less than because of who they are. This is our time to stand together and say, enough." The momentum extended beyond the gig economy, inspiring broader conversations about systemic racism in other industries. Schools, workplaces, and even local governments began hosting forums and implementing training programs to address unconscious bias and promote inclusion. For Jordan, the journey was deeply personal. He often reflected on that night, standing on the dark, empty street with his bags in hand, feeling abandoned and unseen. Now, as he stood before crowds of supporters, sharing his story, he realized that moment of isolation had become the catalyst for something far greater than himself. Out of darkness, he told the crowd at a rally, we found light. And that light will keep shining until every corner of our society is illuminated with justice and equality. The night was calm, the city skyline glowing in the distance as Jordan stood on his apartment balcony. The hum of traffic below blended with the faint laughter of children playing in a nearby park. It was a stark contrast to the night he had been left stranded, cold, alone, and uncertain of what would come next. "I never thought my ride home that night would change my life," Jordan began, his voice steady but reflective. "It wasn't just about the words he said or the way he treated me. It was about the realization that this wasn't just my story. It's the story of so many others who've been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked." He leaned against the railing, staring out at the horizon. His phone buzzed beside him, a notification from yet another person sharing their gratitude for his courage. Jordan picked it up and scrolled through the messages, stories from people he had inspired to speak up, to demand change in their own lives. I didn't ask to be in this position, he admitted. But when it happened, I knew I couldn't stay silent. If I didn't speak out, who would? He thought back to the countless interviews, the rallies, the sleepless nights spent crafting speeches and responding to messages. It had been exhausting, but it was worth it. Every small victory, like the new policies Uber had implemented, or the awareness drive for justice had created, felt like a step towards something bigger. This journey hasn't been easy, Jordan continued, his voice carrying a mix of strength and vulnerability. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the weight of it all felt too heavy. But then I'd remember why I had to keep going. Because standing up for what's right isn't just about you. It's about everyone who comes after you. As Jordan's reflection faded, the screen transitioned to a powerful montage. The faces of others who had experienced discrimination appeared, their voices layered over one another, sharing their stories. I was denied a ride because of my disability. He told me to get out of the car because I didn't speak English. She said my neighborhood wasn't safe, so she canceled the ride before picking me up. The montage ended with a sobering statistic displayed in bold letters. Across the screen, 63% of rideshare users from marginalized communities report experiencing discrimination in some form. Yet only 10% of these incidents are officially reported. The numbers were staggering, a stark reminder of the systemic issues still plaguing the industry. A narrator's voice broke through the silence, calm yet resolute. Jordan's story is just one of many. But it's a reminder that change begins with speaking up. If you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination, know that your voice matters. Together, we can push for fairness, accountability, and inclusivity in every corner of our society. When that door slammed shut and the car sped off that night, I felt powerless, he said. But I learned that power isn't something you wait for, it's something you claim. And even one voice, when it refuses to be silenced, can ignite change. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before delivering his final message. So now I ask you, what will you do to make a difference? Because the fight for justice doesn't end here. It's in every conversation, every action, every decision to stand up and say, this isn't right. One voice can spark a movement. Let's be that spark. Justice begins with you. Why are you kicking me out? Jordan's voice is calm but firm in the reenactment. The driver's dismissive sneer is palpable as he mutters, I don't feel safe with you in my car. As the narration continues, the video shows a flurry of activity on Jordan's social media accounts. Screenshots of his post captioned, kicked out of an Uber because of the color of my skin. This is 2024, and we're still dealing with this. Appear on the screen, followed by a flood of comments. Unbelievable. Stay strong, Jordan. This is why we need change. Sharing your story now. I've had similar experiences. Thank you for speaking out. The numbers climb rapidly, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, until the post goes viral. News headlines flash across the screen. Black passengers' viral video sparks debate about racism in rideshare services. Uber faces backlash after allegations of discrimination. Jordan speaks out. This isn't just about Maine. The young woman, seated in a well-lit studio, looks into the camera, her voice steady but emotional. I remember feeling so humiliated, she says. He made a comment about how my kind was ruining the city, then canceled the ride mid-trip and left me stranded. When I saw Jordan's story, I realized I wasn't alone. Community activists are also featured, passionately discussing the broader implications of Jordan's ordeal. This isn't just about one driver, an advocate says, gesturing emphatically. It's about the system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Rideshare companies need to take responsibility, not just when a story goes viral, but every single day. I was walking my dog when I saw him get out of the car, she recalls. He looked so frustrated, but also determined. I didn't know what was happening at the time, but seeing this now, it breaks my heart. We apologize for your experience and are looking into this matter. Thank you for your patience. Days turn into weeks, and Jordan's frustration grows. The video captures his efforts to escalate the issue, making calls, sending follow-ups, and rallying support on social media. The suspense builds as viewers are left wondering if Uber will take meaningful action or let the issue fade away. The tension peaks when Jordan receives a notification from Uber stating they've closed the case due to insufficient evidence. His shock and disappointment are palpable as he sits at his desk, reading the email out loud. Insufficient evidence, he repeats, incredulous. I sent them the video. What more do they need? But just when it seems like the fight might end in defeat, the tide turns. The viral post catches the attention of a prominent civil rights attorney who offers to represent Jordan pro bono. The video captures their first meeting, where the attorney confidently reassures him, "They're going to hear you, Jordan. We're going to make sure of it." The investigation takes a surprising turn when other former passengers of Mr. White come forward. The screen shows clips of interviews, each one building the case against the driver. "He always had an attitude," one man says. "But when I mentioned I was heading to a predominantly black neighborhood, he outright refused to take me. He told me my hijab made him uncomfortable." A woman shares, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't believe he got away with it for so long." The mounting evidence becomes impossible for Uber to ignore. The video shows a formal email Jordan receives from Uber's corporate office, informing him of Mr. White's permanent ban from the platform and the company's commitment to improving its policies. Justice doesn't always come quickly, the narrator reflects. But when it does, it's because people refuse to stay silent. Jordan's story is proof that one voice can create a ripple effect, the narrator concludes. But the fight for justice doesn't end here. It's up to all of us to demand fairness, to hold companies accountable, and to ensure no one has to face discrimination alone. What will you do to make a difference?